Russian is an East Slavic language and an official language in Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and many minor or unrecognized territories. It is an unofficial but widely spoken language in Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and to a lesser extent, the other countries that were once constituent republics of the Soviet Union and former participants of the Eastern Bloc. Russian belongs to the family of Indo-European languages and is one of the three living members of the East Slavic languages. Written examples of Old East Slavonic are attested from the 10th century and beyond. It is the most geographically widespread language of Eurasia and the most widely spoken of the Slavic languages. It is also the largest native language in Europe, with 144 million native speakers in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. Russian is the eighth most spoken language in the world by number of native speakers and the seventh by total number of speakers. The language is one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations. Russian distinguishes between consonant phonemes with palatal secondary articulation and those without, the so-called soft and hard sounds. This distinction is found between pairs of almost all consonants and is one of the most distinguishing features of the language. Another important aspect is the reduction of unstressed vowels. Stress, which is unpredictable, is not normally indicated orthographically though an optional acute accent may be used to mark stress, such as to distinguish between homographic words, for example and, or to indicate the proper pronunciation of uncommon words or names. Classification. Russian is a Slavic language of the Indo-European family. It is a lineal descendant of the language used in Kievan Rus. From the point of view of the spoken language, its closest relatives are Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian, the other 3 languages in the East Slavic group. In many places in eastern and southern Ukraine and throughout Belarus, these languages are spoken interchangeably, and in certain areas traditional bilingualism resulted in language mixtures, e.g. Syrzhic in eastern Ukraine and Trashianka in Belarus, and East Slavic Old Novgorod dialect, although vanished during the 15th or 16th century, is sometimes considered to have played a significant role in the formation of modern Russian. Also, Russian has notable lexical similarities with Bulgarian due to a common Church Slavonic influence on both languages, as well as because of later interaction in the 19th–20th centuries, although Bulgarian grammar differs markedly from Russian. In the 19th century, the language was often called Great Russian to distinguish it from Belarusian, then called White Russian, and Ukrainian, then called Little Russian. The vocabulary, principles of word formations and, to some extent, inflections and literary style of Russian have been also influenced by Church Slavonic, a developed and partly Russified form of the South Slavic Old Church Slavonic language used by the Russian Orthodox Church. However, the East Slavic forms have tended to be used exclusively in the various dialects that are experiencing a rapid decline. In some cases both the East Slavic and the Church Slavonic forms are in use, with many different meanings. For details, see Russian phonology and history of the Russian language. Over the course of centuries, the vocabulary and literary style of Russian have also been influenced by Western and Central European languages such as Greek, Latin, Polish, Dutch, German, French, Italian and English, and to a lesser extent the languages to the south and the east, Uralic, Turkish, Persian, Arabic, as well as Hebrew. According to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, Russian is classified as a Level 3 language in terms of learning difficulty for native English speakers, requiring approximately 1,100 hours of immersion instruction to achieve intermediate fluency. It is also regarded by the United States intelligence community as a hard target language, due to both its difficulty to master for English speakers and its critical role in American world policy. Standard Russian. The standard form of Russian is generally regarded as the modern Russian literary language. It arose in the beginning of the 18th century with the modernization reforms of the Russian state under the rule of Peter the Great, and developed from the Moscow dialect substratum under the influence of some of the previous centuries' Russian chancellery language. Mikhail Lomonosov first compiled a normalizing grammar book in 1755. In 1783 the Russian Academy's first explanatory Russian dictionary appeared. During the end of the 18th and 19th centuries, during a period known as the Golden Age, the grammar, vocabulary and pronunciation of the Russian language was stabilized and standardized, and it became the nationwide literary language. Meanwhile, Russia's world-famous literature flourished. Until the 20th century, the language's spoken form was the language of only the upper noble classes and urban population, as Russian peasants from the countryside continued to speak in their own dialects. By the mid-20th century, such dialects were forced out with the introduction of the compulsory education system that was established by the Soviet government. Despite the formalization of Standard Russian, some non-standard dialectal features are still observed in colloquial speech. Geographic distribution. In 2010, there were 259.8 million speakers of Russian in the world. In Russia 137.5, in the CIS and Baltic countries 93.7, in Eastern Europe and the Balkans 12.9, Western Europe 7.3, Asia 2.7, Middle East and North Africa 1.3, Sub-Saharan Africa 0.1, Latin America 0.2, USA, Canada, Australia and New Zealand 4.1. Thus, the Russian language is the sixth largest in the world by number of speakers, after English, Mandarin, Hindi, Urdu, Spanish and Arabic. Russian is one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations. Education in Russian is still a popular choice for both Russian as a second language and native speakers in Russia as well as many of the former Soviet republics. Russian is still seen as an important language for children to learn in most of the former Soviet republics. Samuel P. Huntington wrote in The Clash of Civilizations, during the heyday of the Soviet Union, Russian was the lingua franca from Prague to Hanoi. Europe. In Belarus, Russian is co-official alongside Belarusian per the Constitution of Belarus. 77% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 67% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. In Estonia, Russian is officially considered a foreign language. Russian is spoken by 29.6% of the population according to a 2011 estimate from the World Fact Book. Despite large Russian-speaking minorities in Latvia, Russian is officially considered a foreign language. 55% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 26% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. In Lithuania, Russian is not official, but it still retains the function of lingua franca. In contrast to the other 2 Baltic states, Lithuania has a relatively small Russian-speaking minority. In Moldova, Russian is considered to be the language of inter-ethnic communication under Soviet-era law. 50% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 19% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. According to the census of 2010 in Russia, Russian language skills were indicated by 138 million people. while according to the 2002 census 142.6 million people in Ukraine, Russian is seen as a language of inter-ethnic communication and a minority language under the 1996 Constitution of Ukraine. According to estimates from Demoscope Weekly, in 2004 there were 14,400,000 native speakers of Russian in the country, and 29 million active speakers. 65% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 38% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. In the 20th century, Russian was a mandatory language taught in the schools of the members of the Old Warsaw Pact and in other countries that used to be satellites of the USSR. According to the Eurobarometer 2005 survey, fluency in Russian remains fairly high in some countries, in particular those where the people speak a Slavic language and thereby have an edge in learning Russian. Significant Russian-speaking groups also exist in Western Europe. These have been fed by several waves of immigrants since the beginning of the 20th century, each with its own flavor of language. The United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Belgium, Greece, Brazil, Norway, and Austria have significant Russian-speaking communities. Asia. In Armenia, Russian has no official status, but it's recognized as a minority language under the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. 30% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 2% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. In Azerbaijan, Russian has no official status, but is a lingua franca of the country. 26% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 5% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. In Georgia, Russian has no official status, but it's recognized as a minority language under the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. Russian is the language of 9% of the population according to the World Fact Book. Ethnologue cites Russian as the country's de facto working language. In Kazakhstan, Russian is not a state language, but according to Article 7 of the Constitution of Kazakhstan, its usage enjoys equal status to that of the Kazakh language in state and local administration. The 2009 census reported that 10,309,500 people, or 84.8% of the population aged 15 and above, could read and write well in Russian, as well as understand the spoken language. In Kyrgyzstan, Russian is an official language per Article 5 of the Constitution of Kyrgyzstan. The 2009 census states that 482,200 people speak Russian as a native language, or 8.99% of the population. Additionally, 1,854,700 residents of Kyrgyzstan aged 15 and above fluently speak Russian as a second language, or 49.6% of the population in the age group. In Tajikistan, Russian is the language of inter-ethnic communication under the Constitution of Tajikistan. 28% of the population was fluent in Russian in 2006, and 7% used it as the main language with family, friends or at work. The World Fact Book notes that Russian is widely used in government and business. In Turkmenistan, Russian lost its status as the official lingua franca in 1996. Russian is spoken by 12% of the population according to an undated estimate from the World Fact Book. In Uzbekistan, Russian has no official status, but is a lingua franca of the country. Russian is spoken by 14.2% of the population according to an undated estimate from the World Fact Book. In 2005, Russian was the most widely taught foreign language in Mongolia and was compulsory in Year 7 onward as a second foreign language in 2006. Russian is also spoken in Israel by at least 1 million ethnic Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, according to the 1999 census. The Israeli press and websites regularly publish material in Russian. See also Russian language in Israel. Russian is also spoken as a second language by a small number of people in Afghanistan. North America. The language was first introduced in North America when Russian explorers voyaged into Alaska and claimed it for Russia during the 1700s. Although most Russian colonists left after the United States bought the land in 1867, a handful stayed and preserved the Russian language in this region to this day, although only a few elderly speakers of this unique dialect are left. Sizable Russian-speaking communities also exist in North America, especially in large urban centers of the U.S. and Canada, such as New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles, Nashville, San Francisco, Seattle, Spokane, Toronto, Baltimore, Miami, Chicago, Denver, and Cleveland. In a number of locations they issue their own newspapers, and live in ethnic enclaves. Only about 25% of them are ethnic Russians, however. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the overwhelming majority of Russophones in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn and New York City were Russian-speaking Jews. Afterward, the influx from the countries of the former Soviet Union changed the statistics somewhat, with ethnic Russians and Ukrainians immigrating along with some more Russian Jews and Central Asians, according to the United States Census. In 2007, Russian was the primary language spoken in the homes of over 850,000 individuals living in the United States. Australia. Australian cities Melbourne and Sydney have Russian-speaking populations, with the most Russians living in southeast Melbourne, particularly the suburbs of Carnegie and Caulfield. Two-thirds of them are actually Russian-speaking descendants of Germans, Greeks, Jews, Azerbaijanis, Armenians or Ukrainians, who either repatriated after the USSR collapsed, or are just looking for temporary employment. Russian is an international language. Russian is one of the official languages of the United Nations, International Atomic Energy Agency, World Health Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, UNESCO, World Intellectual Property Organization, International Telecommunication Union, World Meteorological Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, International Fund for Agricultural Development, International Criminal Court, International Monetary Fund, International Olympic Committee, Universal Postal Union, World Bank, Commonwealth of Independent States, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Eurasian Economic Community, Collective Security Treaty Organization, Antarctic Treaty Secretariat, International Organization for Standardization, Guam Organization for Democracy and Economic Development, International Mathematical Olympiad. The Russian language is also one of two official languages aboard the International Space Station. NASA astronauts who serve alongside Russian cosmonauts usually take Russian language courses. This practice goes back to the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which first flew in 1975. In March 2013, it was announced that Russian is now the second most used language on the Internet after English. People use the Russian language on 5.9% of all websites, slightly ahead of German and far behind English. Russian is used not only on 89.8% of RU sites, but also in 88.7% of sites with the former Soviet Union domain. SU. The websites of former Soviet Union nations also use high levels of Russian, 79.0% in Ukraine, 86.9% in Belarus, 84.0% in Kazakhstan, 79.6% in Uzbekistan, 75.9% in Kyrgyzstan and 81.8% in Tajikistan. However, Russian is the sixth most used language on the top 1,000 sites, behind English, Chinese, French, German and Japanese. Dialects. Russian is a rather homogeneous language, in terms of dialectal variation, due to the early political centralization under the Moscow rule, compulsory education, mass migration from rural to urban areas in the 20th century, as well as other factors. The standard language is used in written and spoken form almost everywhere in the country, from Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg in the west to Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky in the east, notwithstanding the enormous distance in between. Despite leveling after 1900, especially in matters of vocabulary and phonetics, a number of dialects still exist in Russia. Some linguists divide the dialects of Russian into two primary regional groupings, Northern and Southern, with Moscow lying on the zone of transition between the two. Others divide the language into three groupings, Northern, Central and Southern, with Moscow lying in the central region. All dialects also divided in two main chronological categories, the dialects of primary formation and secondary formation. Dialectology within Russia recognizes dozens of smaller-scale variants. The dialects often show distinct and non-standard features of pronunciation and intonation, vocabulary and grammar. Some of these are relics of ancient usage now completely discarded by the standard language. The Northern Russian dialects and those spoken along the Volga River typically pronounce unstressed O clearly. Besides the absence of vowel reduction, some dialects have higher diphthongal e tilde in the place of Proto-Slavic *e and o tilde u in stressed closed syllables instead of standard Russian e and o. An interesting morphological feature is a post-definite article to ta, te, similarly to that existing in Bulgarian and Macedonian. In the Southern Russian dialects, instances of unstressed e and a following palatalized consonants and preceding a stress syllable are not reduced to being instead pronounced in such positions. This is called yakanye. Consonants include a fricative, a semivowel w tilde u, and x tilde x v tilde x w, whereas the standard and northern dialects have the consonants v and final l and f respectively. The morphology features a palatalized final t in third-person forms of verbs. Some of these features, such as akanye, jakanye, are debuccalized or lenited, a semivowel w tilde u, and palatalized final t in third-person forms of verbs are also present in modern Belarusian and some dialects of Ukrainian, indicating a linguistic continuum. The city of Veliky Novgorod has historically displayed a feature called chokanye, sokanye, where tc and ts were switched or merged. So has been recorded as. Also, the second palatalization of velis did not occur there, so the so-called e squared did not cause kx to shift to tsdzs. Therefore, where standard Russian has the form as attested in earlier texts, among the first to study Russian dialects was Lomonosov in the 18th century. In the 19th, Vladimir Dal compiled the first dictionary that included dialectal vocabulary. Detailed mapping of Russian dialects began at the turn of the 20th century. In modern times, the monumental Dialectological Atlas of the Russian language was published published in 3 folio volumes 1986 to 1989, after 4 decades of preparatory work. Derived languages. Balachka, a dialect spoken in Krasnodar region, Don, Kuban and Terek, brought by relocated Cossacks in 1793 and is based on southwest Ukrainian dialect. During Russification of aforementioned regions in 1920s to 1950s, it was forcefully replaced by Russian language, however is still sometimes used even in media. Thenia, a criminal argot of ancient origin, with Russian grammar, but with distinct vocabulary. Mednia Lush language, a nearly extinct mixed language spoken on Bering Island that is characterized by its Alush nouns and Russian verbs. Padonkavsky jargon, a slang language developed by Padonki of Runet. Qualia, a macaronic language with Russian-derived basic structure and part of the lexicon borrowed from German. Runglish, a Russian English pidgin. This word is also used by English speakers to describe the way in which Russians attempt to speak English using Russian morphology and/or syntax. Russanorsk, an extinct pidgin language with mostly Russian vocabulary and mostly Norwegian grammar, used for communication between Russians and Norwegian traders in the Pomor trade in Finnmark and the Kola Peninsula. Trashianka, a heavily Russified variety of Belarusian used by a large portion of the rural population in Belarus. Taimyr Pidgin Russian, spoken by the Nane-san on the Taimyr Peninsula. Alphabet. Russian is written using a Cyrillic alphabet. The Russian alphabet consists of 33 letters. The following table gives their uppercase forms, along with IPA values for each letter's typical sound. Older letters of the Russian alphabet include which merged to and which both merged to, which merged to, which merged to, which merged to and which later were graphically reshaped into and merged phonetically to ya or a. While these older letters have been abandoned at one time or another, they may be used in this and related articles. The years and originally indicated the pronunciation of ultra-short or reduced UI transliteration because of many technical restrictions in computing and also because of the unavailability of Cyrillic keyboards abroad. Russian is often transliterated using the Latin alphabet. For example, is transliterated Moroz and Misha mice, once commonly used by the majority of those living outside Russia. Transliteration is being used less frequently by Russian-speaking typists in favor of the extension of Unicode character encoding, which fully incorporates the Russian alphabet. Free programs leveraging this Unicode extension are available which allow users to type Russian characters, even on Western QWERTY keyboards. Computing the Russian alphabet has many systems of character encoding. KOIATAR was designed by the Soviet government and was intended to serve as the standard encoding. This encoding was and still is widely used in Unix-like operating systems. Nevertheless, the spread of MS-DOS and OS/2, traditional Macintosh and Microsoft Windows created chaos and ended by establishing different encodings as de facto standards, with Windows 1251 becoming a de facto standard in Russian Internet and email communication during the period of roughly 1995 to 2005. All the obsolete 8-bit encodings are rarely used in the communication protocols and text exchange data formats, being mostly replaced with UTF-8. A number of encoding conversion applications were developed. ICONV is an example that is supported by most versions of Linux, Macintosh and some other operating systems, but converters are rarely needed unless accessing texts created more than a few years ago. In addition to the modern Russian alphabet, Unicode encodes the early Cyrillic alphabet, as well as all other Slavic and non-Slavic but Cyrillic-based alphabets. Orthography. Russian spelling is reasonably phonemic in practice. It is in fact a balance among phonemics, morphology, etymology, and grammar, and, like that of most living languages, has its share of inconsistencies and controversial points. A number of rigid spelling rules introduced between the 1880s and 1910s have been responsible for the former whilst trying to eliminate the latter. The current spelling follows the major reform of 1918, and the final codification of 1956. An update proposed in the late 1990s has met a hostile reception, and has not been formally adopted. The punctuation, originally based on Byzantine Greek, was in the 17th and 18th centuries reformulated on the French and German models. According to the Institute of Russian Language of the Russian Academy of Sciences, an optional acute accent may, and sometimes should, be used to mark stress. For example, it is used to distinguish between otherwise identical words, especially when context does not make it obvious, to indicate the proper pronunciation of uncommon words, especially personal and family names, and to show which is the stressed word in a sentence. Stress marks are mandatory in lexical dictionaries and books for children or Russian learners.